Our next presenter is Mr. Jef Hodges. He is the Grasslands coordinator for the National Bobwhite Quail Initiative from the University of Tennessee. He's going to be talking about the big picture of bobwhites. So, Mr. Hodges, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Give everybody a chance to get settled in. Before I get started, in your packet of materials, there's a couple of things in there that are provided that will give you a little more information about the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. First one is the Bobwhite Revival. This is a pretty good overview that explains a little bit about what we are. I am going to talk about that some in the talk today. And then the other thing is what we call our State of the Bobwhite report, or Bobwhite Almanac. This goes into quite a bit of detail about what the group has done and has accomplished, what the states are doing for bobwhite. Florida has a section in here where they report the habitat acres they've worked on and hunter survey information. This publication here gives you a lot of detail. We do this annually. I'm not sure everybody got the same year report, but you either got the most current one or you got last year's report, one or the other. So those two are in your packet. You can look at those later. So I want to talk about bobwhites kind of from a bigger picture overview. You know, today we're looking at individual properties and talking about bobwhites here in Florida. But bobwhites nationwide, at least range-wide, are experiencing the same thing that we've talked about here today in terms of the decline. Let me see if I can get this thing going forward. All right, where do I have to point it to make it go? Let's do it this way. There we go. Okay.
Oh, but it's not on the screen.
Yeah, it's on the screen. We got it. You're right.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's there. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the decline of bobwhites. That's nothing new. Everybody in here already knows about that, but I'm going to depress you a little bit. We're going to talk about the current status and some of the threats to bobwhites. Gets into some of the conversation we're having in the field about habitat loss and fragmentation. And then I'm going to finish up giving you some detail about what the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative is. Well, I got it working, but now it's the wrong way. Okay, so you've probably seen this before. If you haven't, it's probably not a surprise to you. This is according to the Breeding Bird Survey, which began in 1966, and this particular data is through 2015, shows the decline in bobwhite numbers, and this is throughout the bobwhite range. And you can see there it's about a 3.5% per year average over that time. In the late 60s up through about 1985 or so, the decline was pretty precipitous, and then it started to slow down a little bit from there. But that's kind of the picture of what's been going on range-wide, not just Florida. This next graph is Florida, again, for that same time period, showing about a 4.3% average annual decline. Not quite as steep here in Florida, although the numbers are higher, the decline is not quite as steep. So I guess that's some good news if you want to try to pull anything good out of this decline and the status of bobwhites. And I'm going to take a look at a couple other maps here that just give you a little different perspective of the same thing. And this is from U.S. Geological Survey, Breeding Bird Survey information, just like the other graphs I just showed you. And essentially what this map shows, if you're in red, you're in decline. The blue areas are areas that are actually increasing in quail populations. So throughout all of quail range, it's just, birds are just not doing very good. And this is another look at it. This is relative abundance. And again, you look out there where some of those blue boxes were, they have the highest densities, the highest abundance of bobwhites compared to other parts of the country. So the lighter the color, the lower the abundance, relative abundance. This is all based on these breeding bird surveys, which is a pre-designated route that an individual will drive, and they'll stop every so often, and they'll stop and they'll listen for calling birds, and they'll record that. So this is a really large data set over a lot of years, and it gives us some really good trend information, we think, anyway. I'm gonna look at it one other way, and this one ought to really get your attention. This is probably more depressing than the other graphs that I've showed you. And again, the idea is to get your attention here. In 2016, the Partners in Flight released what they call their Continental Bird Plan, and they analyzed a bunch of different species of birds, grassland birds, scrubland birds, forest birds, a whole bunch of them. And what they did is they looked at the decline, the rate of decline of these birds over time, and they calculated what they call the half-life. In other words, what they're saying, if those birds continue to decline at the current rate in 2016, that in this number of years, that population will be half of what it was in 2016. We're in the Atlantic coast. This is a bird conservation region there in the purple, the Atlantic Coast Bird Conservation Region. And you can see that in 2016, they're predicting the half-life of bobwhite to be 13 years. Okay, we're 3 years into that. So what they're saying, I don't do the math on that, but in 10 more years, unless something happens to the rate of decline, to change that rate of decline, bobwhite population is going to be half of what it was in 2016. I think that's pretty sobering. And you look at these other bird conservation regions as well, they're all have very similar numbers with the exception of Gulf Coast. That's one of the better ones as far as half-life. But it's a pretty bleak picture when you start looking at it in terms of half-life, particularly for the sportsmen and the people that enjoy recreational hunting, bobwhite quail. But I mean, this is reality. This is what we're dealing with. This is what's been going on over time. It's not just unique to Florida or Missouri or Kansas or Pennsylvania or anywhere, but this map shows the known, suspected, or near extirpations. Near extirpations means basically near extinction for all practical purposes. The birds are completely gone from the landscape. So those states you see up there with the null sign through them, that's New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, New Jersey, Delaware. They're all having serious problems. New Jersey closed their wild bobwhite hunting season a couple of years ago. Pennsylvania declared the bobwhite extirpated in their state a couple of years ago. Delaware and West Virginia still have seasons, but for all practical purposes, nobody's hunting them because they don't have any birds there. We don't even really know what the status of the birds are in Wisconsin and Michigan, and that little question mark up there in Ontario. Historically, there were bobwhites in that section of Ontario. New York used to have a bobwhite population. Vermont used to have a bobwhite population. Those birds are gone. So we're undergoing a range contraction. So, you know, what does that really mean in the bigger picture? There's something going on in the way that we're living on the land that's influencing and impacting how those birds are out there. And I'll get into some of the colors that are on this map in another slide a little bit later, but I just wanted to show you that this bobwhite are under a range contraction right now. We've got that half-life number hanging out there. It's time to do something. It's time to make some changes. So what's the common denominator? I mean, why is all of this happening? And what it boils down to is we're losing our native grassland habitat. It's happening everywhere. The native grassland habitat is gone. Now there's components of that obviously quail are going to need that aren't grassland. We need some of that shrubby cover out there as well. This happens to be a picture out of South Georgia. Substitute some different plants in the understory, and it's Central Florida. So, but we're losing a lot of that, and that's really the link between all of these declines in populations throughout the range. One more thing to look at here, and this came out from Aldo Leopold. Most people are probably familiar with Aldo Leopold. He's known as the father of modern wildlife management. In 1929 in Mississippi, he was reporting that 85% of the total land area was suitable for quail. Well, now it's estimated that less than 5%. Okay, that's habitat loss. Half of the forested acres burned each year in 1929. And today we only have a token amount of those acres that are burning on an annual basis. So this loss of habitat has come as a result of a change of land management that's really not bode very well for bobwhites. So we want to look at some of the threats that are out there. And again, this will be range wide. It's not necessarily applies to only here in Florida, but in the southeast, we've got 35 million acres of loblolly pine plantations. They're close planted, closed canopy, and they have that, they just don't have any herbaceous understory in there. That's not quail habitat. Throughout the bobwhite states, which include Texas, northern Nebraska, and basically east over to Pennsylvania and New York, and then all of that area south and east of there, 120 million acres of quote unquote improved grazing lands. Well, most of that improved grazing land is not good for bobwhite. The forage value, the reason that it's good for forage is the reason it's bad for bobwhite. Typically, they're sod forming or some sort of a grass that creates a carpet. They're thick, and the way they're managed, usually they're grazed fairly close to the ground. They don't leave much residual cover. So just the way that they're grown and they're managed is not suitable for bobwhite. And you get through the Midwest, the Corn Belt, and some of the southeastern states, 210 million acres of clean farming. Hedgerows are gone, the grassy ditch banks are gone, fence rows are gone. So it's a huge loss of habitat. And then we've got hundreds of millions of acres of closed canopy forest. When you start to go through the Mid-South, the Midwest, and you get into those hardwood forests, those used to be open woodlands. Those used to be savannas with a grassy understory. Now they're a closed canopy with a little bit of vegetation underneath, but no grassy cover whatsoever, and no self-respecting quail would even think about spending any time in those woods. So what it boils down to is habitat loss and fragmentation. So that's the core of what's going on with the decline of bobwhites. So now that I have sufficiently depressed you, I'm going to try to lift you back up a little bit. I want you to take a look at this next set of graphs that I'm looking at here. The one in the upper left is Iowa, upper right South Carolina, lower left is Missouri, lower right is Kentucky. Those areas are all showing an increase in bobwhite numbers. Those graphs look entirely different than the ones that I just showed you. So there's something special going on there. Why are the birds going up in those? And I could put other states on here. It's just that I picked these out because I had access to these graphs. But Greg, I imagine that you've probably got some graphs that we could have stuck in here that would look very similar to this. Georgia's definitely got some where we could show some increases. So what's different about these places than everywhere else? Well, the difference is those areas are working on what we call a focal scale level. They're working on focal areas. Our approach historically to bobwhite management has been a shotgun approach. And as a biologist, for years, I've told people, you build it, they will come. And it used to be true. But now we've gotten so fragmented that when you build it, there's nowhere for them to come from. There's no way for them to get from where they are to where you've built it. So we've fragmented it so much. So this shotgun approach has not been effective. So we've done, as quail biologists, we've done a really good job of demonstrating that doesn't work. I mean, we've done it for years and it's just not working. So we can't work at a state level scale or a regional scale. We have to work at a focal level scale. And you've heard it talked about before, and I'll get into more detail a little bit later, but that 1,500 acres, trying to work at a larger scale, where if you don't have control of that many acres, then you need to be talking to your neighbors and seeing if you can work with your neighbors on that. So that's really why those areas are showing an increase in quail populations. They've identified a focal area, they've gone in and done habitat improvements, and they're doing the work in a concentrated, focused area at the landscape level that's large enough to show an increase in bird populations. So this is the cover of one of the brochures there in your packet, a Bobwhite Revival, and this gives you a lot more details about what the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative is, but it's a 25-state unified strategy for bobwhite restoration. It's a quail plan that was developed by all 25 states within Bobwhite range for the recovery of bobwhites across the range. So we're trying to work at this national level, or at least range-wide level for bobwhites, to generate some momentum, some action, and get things moving forward for bobwhites. And the states have all come together for this. Each one of these ovals up here, Midwest, Southeast, Northeast, these are the Fish and Wildlife Association of Fish and Wildlife agencies from each of those core areas within the Bobwhite range, and the dark green states are all the states that are part of the NBCI, the 25 states. And there's also a number of other partners. We've had an NRCS involved, Fish and Wildlife Service involved, Forest Services involved, Quail Forever has been involved, Turkey Federation. There's a number of NGOs and federal agencies, another of other people, groups that are put together. They all came together to form this National Bobwhite Technical Committee. It's a technical group of people, all biologists, and I would say the best quail minds that exist in the United States, all come together to form this technical committee. And out of that committee, represented by all 25 states, came the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative, the quail plan, if you will. So briefly, and this is a very consolidated history of the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. It started in 1995 as the Southeast Quail Study Group, a group of biologists that were concerned about decline in quail got together and started talking about it. It was officially recognized by the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, operated for several years as the Southeast Quail Study Group. But one of the highlights I wanted to point out, in 2002, the first National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative plan was published. And that was quite a significant step forward. It was the first time that in the wildlife community that a plan for bobwhite on a range-wide level had been developed. And also because bobwhite are a state trust species, the federal government has no control over rules and regulations related to that. It takes a lot of coordination to get all those states involved in producing that. One of the other highlights that I want to point out is down towards the bottom of the list there, that 2011 NBCI 2.0 was released. This was after roughly 10 years. The plan was revised and a number of changes were made into it. And then another big thing that happened with the NBCI and why I'm standing here today in 2015, there was enough funding available that the group could hire staff people that could actually go out and start to focus on some of these areas, program areas that I'll talk about here in just a couple minutes. So generally the strategy, and we use this often, is from the farmhouse to the White House. The National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative works at the national and regional level and with the states. The states become the delivery mechanism for any of the processes or programs that are worked on or developed through the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. So NBCI as an organization doesn't do any work directly on the land with a landowner. We rely on the state agencies and the NGO partners and the federal government offices and those county offices where they have technical assistant people that are there to deal with landowners. That's how these things are implemented. So the key role is to lead, leverage, or enable. So what we're trying to do is either lead the process, leverage dollars, leverage policy, or create opportunities to enable the states and the NGOs to be able to do more or to focus efforts for bobwhites within their respective areas. Some of you may remember a number of years ago, the old, and I think it was BASF, says we don't make the color green, we make the color greener. NBCI doesn't make habitat, we just make habitat easier to put on the ground. So some of the program areas, and this is part of that hiring and getting a full-time staff on, were to deal with the agricultural croplands. So we have an ag policy liaison that works with the croplands. I'm in charge of the grasslands / grazing lands, and then we have a forest lands coordinator. We also have a communications coordinator that helps disseminate the information that we pull together and bring in, and then we also have science and data, and they play a really important role, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So the agriculture policy and programs, just to give you an example of some of the things that NBCI does, to give you an idea at this national, regional level that we're working at to try to create opportunities for the states to take advantage of. One of those is the Natives First Vegetation Standard for USDA. I spent the last year and a half working on Farm Bill, and my sole objective was to get language inserted into the Farm Bill that created an encouragement for using native vegetation for conservation practices. We were successful in getting a paragraph inserted into the conference report that essentially says the managers recognize the value of native vegetation and encourage the use where practicable. So that was an important thing. Also with the current Farm Bill, our forest coordinator and our ag policy coordinator were able to get more forest thinning and burning. There are now $2 million additional funding available to do forest thinning and burning on pine plantations in order to improve those for bobwhite habitat. Well, not specifically for bobwhite, but the money is there, and if you do that work, it will improve for bobwhite. Have any of you heard of the CP33 habitat buffers for upland birds? This is a cropland practice where the landowners will enroll the border or a portion of the border of the field into native vegetation, and the federal government pays them X number of dollars to do that, and they provide cost share assistance for the establishment of those borders. National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative is responsible for that program. That happened to be in the last Farm Bill, not the 2018 Farm Bill, 2012, maybe the one prior to that, 28 Farm Bill. Anyway, that one's been around for a while, but that's a product of the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. CP33 corners is another one. Pivot corners, that was just recently approved in the last couple of years. Again, that's an NBCI product. That would not be there had it not been for NBCI. Had it not been for NBCI having staff in order to pursue these issues, then those things wouldn't happen. Working lands for wildlife is another one. And there's two geographies. On this particular map, the kind of brown colored area is the bobwhite and grasslands, and the orange colored area is the pine savanna working lands for wildlife project. Now, I'm not familiar with the Florida counties, but you can see which ones up there are highlighted for the bobwhite, the pine savanna ones. I don't know if we're in one of those or not, but I suspect we're really close to one of them if we aren't. But anyway, this is an NRCS program that it doesn't provide any additional funding, but it does provide a focus for implementing, and Carlos, you can tell people more later on, but I just wanted to point that out. And you look up there in Virginia, there's one area there, it's got 2 or 3 counties in green. They're doing both. They're doing bobwhite and grasslands, and they're doing pine savanna. So these programs, excuse me, these programs would not be available had it not been from the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. We worked with NRCS to get these programs on the ground and available. So back to some of the operational arenas. One of the other things that we do as an organization, and we try to provide products and services for the states. I mean, that's more or less what it boils down to. And we provide technical support and coordination through federal agencies USDA agencies, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. We work with all of those, and every time we sit down at the table and talk with them, we talk about bobwhite quail, we talk about native vegetation, we talk about pine and savanna management, we talk about grazing, we talk about replacing introduced forage with native forage in grazing. So those are the kinds of things we talk about with these agencies and groups. We also work with all of our NGO partners, Quail Forever, National Wild Turkey Federation, Quail and Upland Wildlife Federation. There's a number of those groups we work with. One of the things that launched, I think it's probably been 3 or 4 years ago, was the Shortleaf Pine Initiative. That launched as a result of the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. And we also work with the states to what degree we're invited and asked to work with them in their state quail initiatives and any other quail related issues that are going on within their state. So in our communications, we develop fact sheets and different brochures. We do webinars. We have a social media presence. We do press releases. So we try to tell the story. And that's actually one of the reasons that I've been here this week, is try to gather information about a story that we can tell about grazing and bobwhites. And eventually that will lead to the development of a fact sheet that we'll release and make available not only to the state agencies, but also to the NGOs and federal agencies and whatnot. So we're actively engaged in doing that. Again, we're trying to provide products and services to the states. Then we have a communication strategy where we're trying to sell this message of early succession vegetation. And we've developed a series of templates of messaging material that's available. And it's now available to the states, or if it's not now, it will be very soon. The states can then take that and customize it for their state to help sell this message about bobwhite habitat. I want to talk a little bit about the science coordination. And I haven't paid any attention to the time, so Raul or somebody tell me where I am. What? 2 minutes? All right, this will be quick. We host the National Quail Symposium. NBCI has been working on an interstate translocation guidance proposal for wild bobwhites. You've heard them talk about Theron. Talked about it a little bit this morning about translocation. There's states in the east, they're asking states in the west for quail, but there's no kind of guidance or no kind of process to follow there. So we're trying to develop some sort of standardized procedure so we make that work out right. Finally, this coordinated implementation program, and this is where we get into this focal area concept. And so real quick on that, what we do in this focal area is we set area standards and guidelines. And so we establish focal areas in however many states around the 25 states want to establish a focal area. And then in addition to setting up, creating standards for how the focal area is created, we also have monitoring of habitat and birds that goes on with that. And again, that's all done under a standardized process. So one of the things it does is helps manage expectations of the public, because we can come in and say, well, here's what has happened in these other focal areas. Here's what we can expect to happen here. It provides us a national network of demonstration projects. So when we talk about focal areas, we can talk about focal areas in Florida or Georgia or Texas or Virginia or Missouri or Iowa. So we've got something that's applicable to that geography and the habitat types that are in that area. And the important thing is everything's standardized. So we create this national database of information that really can help us enable this adaptive management approach. When somebody tries something and it works, and the monitoring has been done, then everybody else can look at that and say, okay, that worked, and it's all been done under the standardized procedure, so we know that the data that's collected off of it is all good, comparable data. And then it enables that adaptive management approach. So to conclude, we've got the science. We've been able to show through those focal areas where those quail numbers are going up that approach works. And so we're out there promoting that, but the real issue here is the people, the politics, and the money. I mean, we got the science, we know it can be done, we've proven it can be done. Now what we have to do is get the people, the politics, and the money in place to make it happen on a large enough scale that you can feel the impact of it on your property. Unless you happen to be lucky enough to be one of those landowners that's in a focal area or right next door to one, until this thing expands out, it's going to be a challenge, and people, politics, and money is where it's at.